In the scorching heart of the Nevada desert, where dust devils dance and mirages deceive the eye, a broke cowboy named Jake Thornton stumbled upon something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the universe. What began as an ordinary ride through the barren wasteland became an encounter that would change not just his life, but the fate of an entire town. When morning broke, the people of Dustridge would wake to a reality stranger than any fever dream, and Jake would find himself at the center of the most extraordinary event in human history. Jake Thornton had seen better days, and better years for that matter. At 34, the weathered cowboy was riding his aging Mar Seti across the endless expanse of the Mojave Desert just outside Dustridge, Nevada. The small town behind him was dying slowly, its population dwindling from 300 to barely 100 souls, who refused to abandon the place their ancestors had built. Jake himself was down to his last $50, 3 days away from losing his small ranch to the bank, and the cattle he once tended had been sold off months ago to pay debts he couldn't escape. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Jake headed toward the old Henderson property, hoping to find some salvageable fence posts he could sell for scrap. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sand, scrub brush, and ancient rock formations that had witnessed centuries pass without judgment. It was a landscape that taught you humility, reminded you how small you were in the grand scheme of things. That's when Sadie suddenly reared up, nearly throwing Jake from the saddle. The Mari's eyes were wild with terror, something Jake had never seen in the usually calm animal. He struggled to control her, speaking in soothing tones, but she kept backing away from something ahead, her nostrils flaring. Jake squinted into the distance, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his saddle holster. In this part of the desert, threats could range from rattlesnakes to the occasional mountain lion. But what he saw made his blood run cold and his rational mind stumble. About 50 yards ahead, partially concealed behind a cluster of rocks, was a craft of some kind. It wasn't like any vehicle Jake had ever seen, not a plane or helicopter, not experimental military drone. The object was roughly circular, about the size of a small car, and seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly iridescence that hurt to look at directly. Scorch marks radiated outward from where it rested. The sand beneath it fused into glass. And there, sprawled on the ground beside it, was a figure. Jake's first instinct was to turn Sadie around and ride back to town as fast as her legs could carry them. Every survival instinct screamed at him to flee, to pretend he'd never seen this impossible thing. But something else pulled at him, something deeper than fear. The figure wasn't moving. Whatever or whoever it was might be hurt, dying perhaps. Jake had never been the type to leave any creature suffering, and despite the absolute strangeness of what lay before him, he found himself dismounting and approaching on foot, his legs shaking with each step. As he drew closer, his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The being was roughly humanoid in shape, perhaps 4.5 feet tall, with elongated limbs that seemed too delicate to support even its slight frame. Its skin, if you could call it that, appeared to shift between colors, like oil on water, predominantly settling on shades of silver and deep blue. The head was larger in proportion to the body, with features that suggested a face, but were alien in their configuration. Large, almond-shaped eyes were closed, and the being's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. Jake knelt beside the creature, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly. The being was wearing something that might have been clothing or might have been part of its body, a form-fitting material that seemed to pulse faintly with bioluminescent patterns. There was a visible injury on its side, a dark substance that might have been blood seeping through. In that moment, staring at this impossible visitor from beyond the stars, Jake made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He couldn't leave it here to die in the desert heat. Getting the alien back to his ranch proved to be the most surreal experience of Jake's life, and that was saying something given what he'd just witnessed. The being was surprisingly light, weighing perhaps 60 or 70 pounds, and after the initial shock of touching something so otherworldly wore off, Jake managed to carefully lift it and drape it across Sadie's saddle. The Mara remained skittish but seemed to sense the urgency in Jake's movements and allowed him to lead her back toward home. The 3-mile journey felt eternal. Jake's mind raced with questions that had no answers. Was he breaking some kind of law by removing the alien from the crash site? Would the military come looking for it? Would more of them come searching? Most pressingly, how was he supposed to help an injured being whose biology he couldn't begin to understand? Every few minutes, he would check to make sure the creature was still breathing, relieved each time to see the subtle rise and fall of its chest. By the time they reached his small ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jake's property consisted of a modest 1-story house, a barn that had seen better days, and a handful of outbuildings scattered across 20 acres of scrubland. It wasn't much, but it had been in his family for 3 generations, and the thought of losing it to the bank in a few days stung worse than any physical pain. He carried the alien into his house through the back door, not wanting any of his distant neighbors to catch even a glimpse of what he was carrying. Inside, he cleared off his kitchen table and gently laid the being down, grabbing every clean towel he owned to cushion it. Under the harsh light of his kitchen, the alien's features became even more pronounced. The skin had a subtle texture to it, like the finest leather, and those shifting colors continued their mesmerizing dance across its surface. The injury on its side worried Jake most. The dark fluid that oozed from the wound had a strange consistency, thicker than blood, with an almost metallic sheen. He had experience treating injured cattle and horses, but this was so far beyond his expertise, it would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Still, the basics of wound care were universal, right? Clean it, stop the bleeding, prevent infection. He could manage that much. Jake heated water on his stove, added salt to sterilize it, and gathered clean cloths. His hands trembled as he began cleaning around the wound, half expecting the alien to wake up and panic, or worse, reveal some defensive mechanism that would turn him to dust. But it remained unconscious, its breathing growing slightly more stable as he worked. The wound itself was puzzling, appearing to be some kind of burn rather than a cut or impact injury. Perhaps from the crash itself or whatever had caused the crash. As night fell completely, Jake found himself sitting at his kitchen table, watching over his impossible patient. The alien's eyes had remained closed the entire time, but occasionally it would make soft sounds, almost musical in quality. That might have been expressions of pain or perhaps some form of unconscious communication. Jake had fashioned a makeshift bed on his couch, lining it with blankets, and carefully moved the being there once he'd done everything he could for the wound. He tried calling his only real friend in town, Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos, 3 times, but each time his finger hovered over the call button, he stopped himself. What would he even say? How could he explain this without sounding completely insane? And more importantly, what would happen to the alien if he involved the authorities? Images of government agents, secret facilities, and experimentation filled his mind. No, he decided, at least for tonight, he would keep this secret. Jake made a pot of strong coffee and settled into his worn armchair, positioned so he could keep watch over the alien throughout the night. Every creak of the old house made him jump. Every distant sound of a vehicle on the highway sent his heart racing. He thought about the craft still sitting out in the desert, surely visible to anyone who happened to pass by. By morning, someone would find it. By morning, everything would change. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his small ranch house, it was just him and a visitor from the stars. 2 beings trying to survive in an unforgiving universe. Jake must have dozed off sometime before dawn because he woke with a start to find the alien's large eyes open and staring directly at him. The eyes were extraordinary, deep pools of shifting violet and gold that seemed to contain entire galaxies within them. For a moment, neither moved, locked in a stare that transcended species and worlds. Then the alien made a sound, a series of melodic tones that reminded Jake of wind chimes mixed with whale song, and slowly raised one of its elongated hands toward him. Terror and wonder warred within Jake as he remained frozen in his chair. The alien's hand moved with deliberate slowness, clearly not wanting to startle him, and gently touched his forehead. Instantly, Jake felt a rush of sensations that nearly overwhelmed him. Images flooded his mind, not quite words, but concepts and feelings that he somehow understood. The alien's name, or at least something approximating one in human terms, was a sound like Zephyr. It came from a world so distant that the light from Earth hadn't even reached it yet. It had been on a reconnaissance mission, observing humanity from afar, when its ship had been struck by something, a weapon from another species that humans didn't even know existed, forcing an emergency landing. The connection broke, and Jake gasped, his heart pounding. Zephyr withdrew its hand and made another series of sounds, this time clearly expressing gratitude. Jake understood somehow that the alien was thanking him for the help, for not leaving it to die in the desert. More importantly, Zephyr was trying to explain that they needed to leave, to get to somewhere safe, before the hostile species that had shot them down tracked them to this location. Before Jake could process this terrifying new information, the sound of vehicles approaching shattered the morning quiet. He rushed to the window and felt his stomach drop. 3 large black SUVs were pulling up his driveway, followed by what looked like a military transport vehicle. Men in dark suits and others in military fatigues were already exiting, their faces grim and purposeful. Someone had found the crash site. Someone had tracked Zephyr here. Jake turned back to the alien, whose eyes had widened in what could only be described as fear. "We need to hide you," Jake said, knowing Zephyr couldn't understand his words, but hoping the intent was clear. He helped the alien to its feet, noting that it moved with less pain than the night before, and guided it toward the basement door. The old cellar beneath his house was small and musty, filled with forgotten boxes and old furniture, but it would have to do. Just as Jake closed the cellar door, heavy fists pounded on his front door. "Mr. Thornton, this is Colonel Marcus Hayes with the United States Air Force. We need to speak with you immediately regarding a matter of national security." The voice was authoritative, used to being obeyed without question. Jake took a deep breath, ran his hands through his hair to compose himself, and opened the door. Colonel Hayes was a stern-faced man in his 50s, flanked by 4 armed soldiers. Behind him, Jake could see more personnel establishing a perimeter around his property, setting up equipment and speaking urgently into radios. "Colonel," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what's this about?" Hayes stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the room. "Mr. Thornton, we detected an unidentified craft crashing in the desert, approximately 10 miles from here yesterday evening. Thermal imaging showed the craft was moved shortly after impact. We tracked the heat signature directly to your property." He turned to face Jake directly. "Where is it?" Jake felt sweat forming on his brow despite the cool morning air. "I don't know what you're talking about, Colonel. I was out riding yesterday, but I didn't see any crash. Just came home and had dinner like normal." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but something told him that handing Zephyr over to the military would be a death sentence for the alien. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Thornton, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. We have evidence of extraterrestrial contact. This is the most significant event in human history, and you are obstructing a federal investigation. If you're hiding something, I strongly suggest you cooperate now before this becomes a matter involving federal charges." From the basement, Jake heard the faintest sound, a musical note that made his heart skip. The colonel heard it too, his head snapping toward the cellar door. What was that? he demanded, his hand moving to the sidearm at his hip. Time seemed to slow as Colonel Hayes moved toward the basement door, his soldiers immediately raising their weapons. Jake's mind raced, calculating odds and outcomes, all of them ending badly. But before anyone could open the cellar door, a brilliant flash of light erupted from within, so intense that everyone in the room instinctively shielded their eyes. When the light faded seconds later, Zephyr stood at the top of the basement stairs, its form seeming to shimmer with an inner radiance, those extraordinary eyes fixed on the colonel, with an intensity that made the hardened military man take an involuntary step backward. The alien raised both hands in what was clearly a gesture of peace, and then something remarkable happened. Zephyr began to speak, not in its musical language, but in clear, unaccented English. "Please, do not fear. I mean no harm to your world or your people. I am Zephyr of the Andalese Collective, and I come seeking only temporary refuge before I can repair my vessel and leave your planet." The room erupted in chaos. Soldiers shouted into radios, calling for backup and scientific teams. Colonel Hayes, despite his obvious shock, managed to maintain some composure. "How did you learn our language?" he demanded, his hand still on his weapon but not drawing it. Zephyr's form seemed to pulse gently as it responded. "My people have observed your species for what you would measure as 3,000 years. We have studied your languages, your cultures, your conflicts, and your achievements. We do not interfere, only observe and record, but circumstances beyond my control have forced this direct contact." Jake watched in amazement as Zephyr explained its situation, describing the attack by a hostile alien species called the Drexen, who were slowly advancing through this sector of the galaxy, consuming resources and enslaving or destroying civilizations they encountered. The Andalese Collective had been monitoring the Drexen's movements, trying to warn potential target worlds, but their policy of non-interference prevented direct contact until absolutely necessary. Zephyr's ship had been damaged while documenting Drexen movements near Earth, forcing the emergency landing. "And why should we believe any of this?" Colonel Hayes asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "How do we know you're not the threat? That this isn't some elaborate invasion story?" Zephyr turned its gaze to Jake, and he felt that connection again, that strange communion of minds. "This human saved my life when he had every reason to fear me, to leave me to die, or to immediately contact your authorities. He showed compassion without understanding, kindness without expectation of reward. If one of your kind can demonstrate such nobility, perhaps your species is worth saving from what is coming." The colonel's expression hardened. "What do you mean? What is coming?" The alien moved to the window, looking out at the desert landscape bathed in morning light. "The Drexen tracked my escape vector. They know I landed somewhere in this region. They will send scouts, perhaps as early as tonight, to ensure I did not survive to warn your world. When they discover that your species has no real defense against them, they will mark Earth as a resource planet for future harvesting. Your people have perhaps 20 of your years before the main fleet arrives. Maybe less if they decide Earth's resources are immediately valuable." Silence fell over the room like a shroud. Jake could see the implications dawning on everyone's faces, the weight of this revelation crushing down on them. Everything Zephyr was saying sounded insane, impossible, but there was an undeniable ring of truth to it. And standing there in his small ranch house was living proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe. Colonel Hayes pulled out his phone and stepped outside, speaking urgently to someone. Jake moved closer to Zephyr, keeping his voice low. "Are we really in that much danger?" The alien's eyes met his, and Jake saw something he recognized despite the vast differences between their species: genuine concern. "Yes, your world has achieved much in a short time, but you are still children in galactic terms. You are not ready for what the Drexen represent. However," Zephyr paused, its colors shifting to warmer tones, There may be a way. My ship's communication array was damaged, but if I could repair it, I could send a message to my people. The Angeles Collective has resources, technology, knowledge that could help protect your world, but only if we can convince them that humanity is worth the breach of our non-interference directive. Hayes returned, his face pale but determined. I've contacted the president's office. They're assembling a team of scientists, military advisors, and diplomats. Everyone's being airlifted here within the next few hours. He looked at Zephyr with a mixture of fear and awe. If what you're saying is true, if we're really facing an alien invasion, then we need every advantage we can get. What do you need to repair your ship? By mid-afternoon, Jake's small ranch had transformed into a hub of frantic activity that would have been unbelievable just 24 hours earlier. Helicopters had brought in scientists from NASA, MIT, and various military research facilities. The president had addressed the nation an hour ago, revealing the truth about extraterrestrial contact and urging calm, though reports from around the world showed anything but calm, panic, and wonder spreading in equal measure across the globe. Zephyr stood at the center of it all, surrounded by equipment, monitors, and dozens of specialists trying to understand the alien technology scattered across Jake's property. The crashed ship had been transported here, loaded onto trucks and pieces, its strange materials baffling the best minds humanity could assemble. The alien worked tirelessly, trying to explain concepts that human science barely had frameworks to understand, let alone implement. Jake found himself pushed to the sidelines, watching as his quiet life was consumed by the biggest event in human history. Maria Santos, his deputy sheriff friend, had arrived with the first wave of local law enforcement, her eyes wide with disbelief when she saw Zephyr. "Jake," she had whispered, gripping his arm, "what have you gotten us into?" But as the day wore on, Jake noticed something troubling. Zephyr was growing weaker. The alien's colors, which had been vibrant earlier, were now fading to pale, washed-out shades. Its movements had become slower, more labored. When Jake finally pushed through the crowd of scientists to reach Zephyr's side, he could see exhaustion written across those alien features. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, touching Zephyr's arm gently. The alien turned to him, and for a moment, that mental connection opened again. Jake felt a wave of weakness, of biological systems struggling to function in Earth's atmosphere. Zephyr had been injured more seriously than it had revealed. The crash and the weapon strike had damaged not just the ship, but the alien's ability to filter the oxygen-nitrogen mixture that humans breathed. Zephyr was essentially suffocating slowly, its own biology poisoning itself in an environment slightly wrong for its physiology. "Carl Hayes!" Jake shouted, drawing everyone's attention. "Zephyr's dying. The atmosphere here is wrong. We need to do something now." The revelation sent the scientists into a frenzy of activity. They tried creating sealed environments with different gas mixtures, but without knowing Zephyr's exact atmospheric requirements, they were essentially guessing. The alien tried to explain the needed ratios, but the communication barrier of technical terms in unknown sciences proved too great. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking not just on Zephyr's life, but on humanity's chance to send that crucial message to the Angeles Collective. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of red that now seemed ominous rather than beautiful, Zephyr made a decision. With the last of its strength, the alien activated a device that had survived the crash, a small crystalline object that began to pulse with soft light. Through their mental connection, Jake understood what was about to happen. Zephyr was going to upload its consciousness, its memories, its entire being into this device, essentially dying physically, but preserving its mind in a form that could survive. "Wait," Jake said desperately. "There has to be another way. We can figure this out. Just give us more time." But Zephyr's colors were now almost completely gray. The alien placed one hand on Jake's face, and images flooded through him. Zephyr's home world, a planet of crystalline structures and luminous skies, cities that grew like living things, technology indistinguishable from art, family. Though the concept was different from human families, beings connected by choice and philosophy rather than blood. And the mission, the desperate hope that humanity could be saved from the fate that awaited them. "You saved me once," Zephyr's voice echoed in Jake's mind. "Now I entrust you with saving your world. The crystal will contain all my knowledge, my ship's access codes, communications protocols. Find someone who can interface with it. Use what I give you to reach my people. Tell them that humanity deserves a chance. Tell them about the cowboy who showed kindness to a stranger from the stars." Before Jake could protest further, Zephyr's form began to dissolve into streams of light that flowed into the crystal. The scientists watched in awe and horror as the physical body faded away completely, leaving only the pulsing crystal floating in the air before gently settling into Jake's outstretched hands. The device was warm, almost alive, and Jake could feel something within it, a presence that was unmistakably Zephyr. Colonel Hayes approached slowly, his expression grave. "Mr. Thornton, I need you to hand over that device. Our scientists need to study it, extract whatever information it contains." But Jake's hands closed around the crystal protectively. Something had changed in him over the past day, a fundamental shift in how he saw the universe and his place in it. "No," he said, quietly but firmly. "Zephyr trusted me with this. Whatever happens next, I'm part of it." The next 3 weeks became a blur of activity that transformed not just Dustridge, but the entire world. Jake's ranch became the center of what the media dubbed First Contact Ground Zero, and the poor cowboy, who had been days away from losing everything, found himself thrust into a role he never imagined: humanity as bridge to the stars. The crystal that held Zephyr's consciousness proved to be beyond even the most advanced technology Earth possessed. But eventually, a team of quantum computing specialists from Japan managed to create an interface that allowed limited communication. Through this bridge, Zephyr guided human scientists in understanding the salvaged ship's technology, and more importantly, in reconstructing the communications array needed to reach the Andalese Collective. Jake spent hours each day connected to the interface, serving as an intermediary between Zephyr's alien consciousness and the human teams. The bond they had formed in those first moments proved crucial. Zephyr could communicate more clearly through Jake than through any technical interface alone. It was exhausting work, mentally and emotionally draining, but Jake never complained. He had found a purpose greater than simply surviving day to day. The promised Drexen scouts arrived on the 15th night after Zephyr's transformation. 3 small ships descended on the desert outside Dustridge, but thanks to Zephyr's warnings and the technology humans had begun to understand, they were ready. The scouts were driven off by weapons adapted from Zephyr's ship designs, improvised but effective enough to send a message: Earth would not be easy prey. Finally, 21 days after Jake had found a dying alien in the desert, the communications array was complete. It was a massive structure now, rising from the desert floor like a metallic tree, incorporating both Zephyr's technology and humanity's desperate innovation. Representatives from every nation had gathered in Dustridge, this tiny dying town now the most important place on Earth, to witness humanity's first deliberate message to another civilization. Jake stood at the control center, his hand on the crystal that contained his friend's essence as the array powered up. Zephyr's voice, clearer now through the enhanced interface, guided him through the activation sequence. The message that went out into the cosmos was simple but profound: a plea for help, an acknowledgement of humanity's youth and vulnerability, but also a demonstration of their capacity for compassion, innovation, and courage in the face of the impossible. The response came faster than anyone expected, just 3 hours later. The Andalese Collective had listening posts closer to Earth than Zephyr had known, maintained specifically to monitor Drexen movements in this sector. A message appeared on screens around the world simultaneously, translated into every major language. Message received. Help is coming. Prepare yourselves. The celebration that erupted across Dustridge and around the world was tempered by the reality that the real work was just beginning. The Andelese Collective would send advisors, technology, and defensive platforms. But humanity would need to unite like never before to prepare for the threat looming in their future. Old conflicts and national boundaries seemed trivial when faced with the vastness of space and the dangers it contained. In the weeks that followed, Jake's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. The bank forgave his debts. In fact, the government purchased his ranch for an amount that made him wealthy beyond his modest dreams, transforming it into a permanent embassy for alien contact. He was offered positions with NASA, the newly formed Earth Defense Initiative, and countless other organizations. But Jake made a different choice. He became the official liaison to Zephyr, dedicating himself to learning everything the alien consciousness could teach him about the galaxy, its wonders and its dangers. The crystal remained always nearby, and through it, Jake maintained his friendship with the being who had changed his life and his world. On the 6-month anniversary of that fateful day in the desert, Jake stood on a platform addressing the United Nations, Zephyr's crystal resting on a pedestal beside him. He spoke about the importance of preserving what made humanity special, even as they reached for the stars: compassion, curiosity, and the courage to help a stranger in need. I was a broke cowboy with nothing left to lose, Jake told the assembled representatives of Earth's nations. And in my darkest moment, I was given a gift, the chance to make a difference, to prove that kindness matters even in an infinite universe. Each of us has that same power. The aliens aren't coming to save us, they're coming to help us save ourselves. And that starts with remembering what Zephyr saw in humanity that night in the desert: the capacity to be better than our fears, to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation. As he spoke, the crystal pulsed with warm light, Zephyr's approval and affection radiating through it. The poor cowboy and the alien explorer, two beings from opposite ends of the galaxy, had forged a friendship that would echo through history. The first chapter in humanity's journey to the stars. And in the small town in Nevada that had been dying just months before, life bloomed anew as people from around the world came to witness the place where everything changed, where a simple act of kindness opened the door to infinite possibilities. The next morning, as Jake rode Sadie out into the desert, the landscape looked the same as it always had: endless, harsh, beautiful. But everything was different now. Humanity was no longer alone, no longer ignorant of the dangers and wonders that awaited them. And it had all started with one man choosing compassion over fear, connection over isolation. Above him, the first Andelese ship began its descent through Earth's atmosphere, a silver gleam against the blue sky, carrying with it the promise of alliance, knowledge, and hope. Jake smiled, feeling Zephyr's presence in the crystal at his belt, and urged Sadie toward the landing site. There was work to do, a world to protect, and an entire galaxy waiting to be discovered. The poor cowboy's story had become humanity's story, and it was only just beginning. Tenter novamente.